Jake Turner sat in his cramped apartment on Mars Colony 7, staring at his tablet screen with bloodshot eyes. It was 3 in the morning, and he should have been sleeping, but sleep was a luxury for people who didn't have creditors breathing down their necks. His salvage business was barely staying afloat, and he needed a win. Fast. The Galactic Surplus Exchange was where desperate humans like him went to find opportunities. Most of the listings were garbage. Literally. Broken mining equipment that would cost more to fix than replace. Derelict freighters filled with radiation. Asteroid claims that turned out to be worthless rock. But Jake scrolled through it all anyway, because sometimes, just sometimes, you found a diamond in the rough. That's when he saw it. Lunar Installation Theta 7. The listing was bare bones, almost insulting in its brevity. Pre-integration human facility, non-functional, sold as is, no refunds. The starting bid was 0.5 galactic credits. In Earth money, that was about 50 cents. Jake leaned forward, squinting at the screen. 50 cents for an entire moon base? That couldn't be right. He clicked on the listing details, and his heart sank a little. The base was located on some forgotten moon orbiting a gas giant way out on the edge of human-claimed space. According to the records, it had been abandoned 200 years ago, back when humanity was still figuring out the whole space colonization thing. The place had been mothballed when better sites were found closer to Earth. The chat section below the listing was already filling up with comments, and none of them were kind. A Vrixian trader with an unpronounceable name typed that human ruins were technologically quaint at best. Some Corthian economist pointed out that the moon itself was mineral poor and strategically worthless. Another alien, species unknown, added a laughing emoji and said they wouldn't take the base if someone paid them. Jake felt a familiar anger rising in his chest. It was the same feeling he got whenever aliens dismissed human achievements. Sure, humanity was the new kid on the galactic block. Sure, they'd only joined the galactic community 15 years ago. But that didn't mean human engineering was worthless. Those early colonists had built installations that lasted centuries with technology that was primitive by today's standards. That took guts and ingenuity. He looked at his account balance. 37 credits. Enough to eat for another month if he was careful. Enough to pay the minimum on his equipment loans. Or enough to take a stupid, reckless gamble on a moon base nobody else wanted. His sister's voice echoed in his head, the same lecture she'd given him last month when he'd bought that supposedly valuable alien artifact that turned out to be a fancy paperweight. You need to think things through, Jake. You can't just throw money at every shiny object that catches your eye. You're 34 years old. When are you going to start acting like it? But Jake wasn't thinking about his sister's disappointment. He was thinking about scrap metal prices. Even a dead base had value if you broke it down to components. Hull plating, wiring, computer systems, life support equipment. Add it all up and 50 cents could turn into 500 credits, maybe more. It would take weeks of work, sure, but he had time. Time was all he had lately. The auction timer showed 10 minutes remaining. Still no other bids. Jake's finger hovered over the bid button. This was insane. The base was probably a complete wreck. The airlock might not even open. He could spend months getting out there only to find a pile of useless debris. But what if it wasn't? What if there was something valuable left behind? What if the reason it was abandoned had nothing to do with the base itself? People left things behind all the time. Equipment, supplies, data cores that might still be intact. 50 cents was practically free. 5 minutes left. Jake took a deep breath and placed his bid. 0.5 credits. His account balance dropped to 36.5 credits. He watched the timer count down, waiting for someone to outbid him at the last second. That's usually how these things went. Someone would swoop in and snatch it away. 4 minutes. 3 minutes. The alien chat continued mocking the listing. One of them made a joke about how humans collected junk like some species collected shiny rocks. Jake clenched his jaw. 2 minutes. 1 minute. 30 seconds. Nobody else bid. At 0, the auction closed and a confirmation message popped up on his screen. Congratulations, you are now the proud owner of Lunar Installation Theta 7. Transfer of ownership documents will be processed within 24 hours. Jake stared at the message, a mixture of excitement and dread washing over him. He just bought an entire moon base for the price of a sandwich. His friends were going to think he'd lost his mind. His sister was definitely going to call him an idiot. But as he sat there in the dim light of his apartment, surrounded by unpaid bills and broken dreams, Jake allowed himself a small smile. He'd made bigger mistakes for a lot more money. At least this one had potential. The next morning, he started making preparations. He loaded his small transport ship with cutting equipment, portable life support, enough food and water for a month. The journey would take 2 weeks through a series of relay gates. The moon wasn't exactly on the beaten path. When he finally arrived and saw the base for the first time through his viewport, his heart sank. The place looked exactly as advertised. Dead and forgotten. The solar panels were cracked and useless. The airlock was sealed tight with 2 centuries of rust. No lights, no signs of power, nothing to suggest this had ever been a functioning facility. Jake guided his ship into a landing orbit and suited up. Maybe this was a mistake after all. Maybe he really had just wasted 50 cents and 2 weeks of his life. But then his scanner picked up something odd. A faint energy signature, coming from deep underground. The base had power. Somewhere down there, something was still running after 200 years. Jake grabbed his plasma torch and grinned inside his helmet. That 50 cents was starting to look like the bargain of a lifetime. The plasma torch sputtered and hissed as Jake cut through the outer airlock door. 2 centuries of rust and vacuum had welded it shut, and it took him nearly 3 hours to carve an opening large enough to squeeze through. His suit's temperature gauge climbed steadily from the heat, and sweat dripped into his eyes, but he kept working. That power signature wasn't going to investigate itself. When the door finally gave way with a metallic groan, Jake found himself staring into absolute darkness. His helmet lights cut through the gloom, revealing a narrow corridor lined with ancient equipment. Everything was covered in a fine layer of dust that hadn't been disturbed in lifetimes. The air inside registered as vacuum on his sensors, which made sense. Without power to the life support systems, any atmosphere would have leaked away decades ago. Jake spent the first day just making the upper levels safe enough to work in. He set up a portable generator, got basic lighting running, and established a small habitable zone where he could take off his suit without dying. The base was bigger than the listings had indicated. Room after room stretched out in every direction, each one filled with equipment from an era when humanity was still figuring out how to survive beyond Earth. Personal belongings were scattered everywhere, and that bothered Jake more than he wanted to admit. Coffee mugs still sat on desks. Family photos and sealed frames hung on walls. A child's toy spaceship lay abandoned in what must have been crew quarters. It looked like everyone had just gotten up one day and walked away, leaving their entire lives behind. What could make people abandon a place so quickly they didn't even pack? He found a computer terminal that still had residual power and managed to boot it up. The logs were corrupted, fragmented beyond repair. He caught glimpses of daily routine reports, maintenance schedules, someone's birthday party invitation. Then the entries became sporadic, worried. References to something discovered during a routine maintenance check. An urgent message to Earth that apparently never got sent. Then nothing. The logs just stopped, and the base became a ghost town. On the 3rd day, Jake couldn't ignore his curiosity any longer. That power signature was calling to him like a siren song. He grabbed his gear and headed for the maintenance shaft he'd located on the schematics. According to the official plans, it should have gone down maybe 50 meters to access the base's geothermal power systems. The shaft went much, much deeper than that. Jake descended carefully, his boots clanging against metal rungs that seemed to go on forever. His suit lights showed the walls changing as he went lower. The utilitarian human construction with its welded seams and bolt patterns gradually gave way to something else entirely. The walls became smoother, almost organic in their curves. There were no visible joints or fasteners. It was like someone had carved the tunnel from a single piece of stone, except stone didn't glow with a faint bioluminescence that made his radiation counter click faster. His oxygen gauge started fluctuating wildly even though his suit integrity showed perfect. The temperature readings made no sense, jumping between freezing and scorching hot with no pattern. Jake's rational mind screamed at him to turn back, that this was way outside his pay grade. But his curiosity was stronger than his fear. It always had been. After what felt like hours, his boots hit solid ground. He stood at the bottom of the shaft in a small chamber that opened into something larger ahead. And there, blocking his path, was a door that definitely wasn't built by human hands. It was massive, easily 5 meters tall and half as wide. The surface was covered in symbols that hurt to look at directly. They seemed to shift and writhe in his vision, never quite staying in one configuration. His translation software, which could handle 4 to 7 known alien languages, couldn't make sense of any of it. The symbols weren't from any species in the galactic community. Jake was sure of that. He stood there for a long moment, his heart hammering in his chest. Every instinct told him to be careful, to call for backup, to do anything except touch that door. But he was alone on a forgotten moon, and backup was weeks away. Besides, he hadn't come this far to turn back now. Jake reached out with a gloved hand, intending to just examine the surface. But the moment his fingers came close to the symbols, something strange happened. His hand moved on its own, tracing patterns in the air that he didn't consciously choose. It felt right somehow, like remembering something he'd never learned. Like muscle memory from someone else's muscles. The door responded. The symbols flared with brilliant light, and a deep thrumming sound resonated through the chamber. Jake stumbled backward as the massive door began to split down the middle, ancient mechanisms groaning to life after who knew how long. Beyond the opening was a chamber that made Jake's brain hurt to comprehend. It was larger inside than it should have been, bigger than the entire moon base above it, maybe bigger than the moon itself. The laws of physics he understood suggested this space couldn't exist. Yet here it was. The chamber was filled with crystalline structures that rose from the floor like trees in a forest. Each one pulsed with inner light, colors that Jake had never seen before and couldn't name. They created patterns in the air, information flowing between them in streams of pure luminescence. At the center of it all stood a pedestal, and floating above it was an orb of absolute darkness wrapped in threads of golden energy. The threads moved like living things, constantly weaving and unweaving, holding the darkness in check. Jake took a step forward, and that's when it happened. Information exploded into his mind like a dam breaking. Star charts of galaxies he'd never heard of. Quantum equations that made Einstein look like basic arithmetic. Biological data on thousands of species, their evolutionary paths, their genetic codes. And humans. So much information about humans, their history, their potential, their place in something far larger than he'd ever imagined. This wasn't just a room. It was a repository. A library built by someone who wanted to preserve knowledge across time itself. And according to the overwhelming flood of data now burning through Jake's consciousness, it had been waiting here for over 50,000 years. 50,000 years, sitting beneath a moon that early human colonists had chosen almost at random for a base. Except it wasn't random. The original crew had found something. They'd discovered this chamber, and their discovery had been classified, buried, forgotten during the chaos of Earth's unification wars. The base was abandoned not because it was worthless, but because someone wanted this secret to stay hidden. Jake fell to his knees, his mind struggling to process the sheer volume of information. He saw images of species that existed before humanity learned to make fire. Civilizations that spanned galaxies and then vanished. Technology that made current galactic community achievements look like stone tools. And woven through it all, one phrase kept repeating in his mind, in a language he shouldn't understand but somehow did. The harvest is coming. Jake didn't know what that meant, but the dread in his gut told him it wasn't good. He looked up at the dark orb with its golden restraints and realized he'd just stumbled into something infinitely bigger than a salvage opportunity. His 50-cent investment had just become the most expensive bargain in human history. Jake stumbled out of the chamber with his mind on fire. Information was still flooding through his consciousness in waves he couldn't control. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw star charts of galaxies colliding, mathematical formulas that explained the fundamental nature of reality, and histories of civilizations that rose and fell millions of years before humans discovered agriculture. His chronometer said he'd been down there for 20 minutes, but his body insisted it had been hours. Maybe days. He made it back to his habitable zone and collapsed onto his sleeping bag, shaking. The repository had downloaded something into his brain, and his thoughts were no longer entirely his own. He knew things now. Terrible things. Beautiful things. Things that made him question everything humanity thought it understood about the universe. The galactic community was young. Pathetically young. Only 12,000 years old, and most species thought that was ancient. They bragged about their histories and their technologies like children showing off their first drawings. But Jake had seen what came before. The galaxy had hosted intelligent life for millions of years, and civilizations rose and fell in predictable cycles. The species currently flying around in their fancy ships were just the latest batch, ignorant of the patterns that governed their existence. The architects. That's what the repository called the ones who built it. They'd come before the current cycle, before the galactic community, before any species Jake had ever heard of. They'd spent millions of years cataloging everything. Every planet that could support life, every species that showed potential for intelligence, every technological pathway that civilizations might follow. And they'd left repositories scattered across the galaxy, time capsules filled with knowledge meant to guide whoever came next. But there was more. Something darker that made Jake's stomach twist. The architects had discovered a pattern, a cosmic cycle that repeated every 50,000 years. something came. Something vast and incomprehensible that pruned back intelligent life when it spread too far, advanced too fast. The architects called it the correction, and they tried to stop it. They'd failed. Now they were gone, and their repositories were all that remained. Jake wanted to believe it was just a story, ancient superstition from a dead civilization. But the knowledge burning in his mind felt too real, too certain. The correction was coming. It was always coming. And humanity had no idea what was waiting for them in the dark. He'd just started to catch his breath when every alarm in his ship screamed at once. Jake scrambled to his feet and pulled up the sensor display, his heart already sinking. 3 contacts had just entered the system, and they were all heading straight for his moon. The first ship registered as Vrikshan, one of their science vessels by the configuration. The Vrikshans were the intellectuals of the galactic community, always poking their tentacles into anything that seemed remotely interesting. The second was Korthian military, a frigate bristling with weapons that could turn his little transport into vapor. The Korthians were the enforcers, the ones who made sure nobody stepped too far out of line. The third ship didn't match anything in his database. It was old, really old, with a design that predated the current galactic community architecture. The hull configuration suggested it was built for deep space travel across distances that would take normal ships decades. And it was putting out a signal that made Jake's teeth hurt, some kind of quantum broadcast that his equipment couldn't properly decode. Jake's hands shook as he pulled up the communications array. How did they know? How could they possibly know he'd found the repository? He'd been alone out here for 3 days, and he hadn't sent any messages. He'd been planning to, sure, once he figured out what he'd discovered. But he'd been too overwhelmed to even think about contacting Earth. Then the answer came to him, knowledge from the repository clicking into place like a puzzle piece. When he'd opened the chamber, when he'd touched that dark orb and received all that information, the repository had sent out a signal. An activation beacon. It was designed to alert specific parties that someone had accessed the knowledge inside. The architects had built-in safeguards, ways to ensure their repositories didn't fall into the wrong hands. Apparently, Jake had just triggered every alarm bell for light years around. He watched the 3 ships adjust their trajectories, moving into orbital positions around the moon. They weren't trying to hide their presence. The Vrikshan vessel was already launching survey drones. The Korthian frigate had powered up its weapons systems, not targeting anything yet but making it clear they were ready. The unknown ship just hung there in space, silent and ominous, like a predator watching its prey. Jake's communication system pinged. Incoming transmission on multiple frequencies. All 3 ships were trying to contact him simultaneously. His finger hovered over the accept button, but something in his gut told him that once he answered, everything would change. Right now, he was just a human salvager who'd gotten lucky. The moment he acknowledged what he'd found, he'd become something else entirely. A target. A threat. A problem that needed to be solved. The repository had shown him fragments of information about these visitors. The Vrikshans had ancient records, fragments of knowledge passed down through their history about places that should never be disturbed. They called them the Forbidden Archives, and they'd been searching for them for thousands of years. Smart Money said they wanted to claim the repository for themselves, add its knowledge to their already considerable databases. The Korthians were more complicated. Their military presence suggested they didn't want anyone claiming the repository. They were probably here to destroy it, to ensure its knowledge stayed buried. The Korthians valued stability above all else. They'd built their entire society around maintaining order in the galactic community. Information that could upset the balance of power was dangerous, and dangerous things needed to be eliminated. But it was the 3rd ship that worried Jake most. The knowledge from the repository whispered warnings about something called the Warden Collective. They were survivors from the last cycle, species that had escaped the correction by hiding, by making themselves small and invisible. They'd been operating in the shadows of galactic society for 50,000 years, guiding things from behind the scenes, ensuring no civilization advanced too quickly or spread too far. Humanity terrified them. Humans had reached space faster than any species in recorded history. They'd broken through technological barriers that should have taken thousands of years in just a few centuries. They joined the galactic community and immediately started causing chaos, asking uncomfortable questions, refusing to accept that certain things were impossible. To the Wardens, humanity represented everything they'd spent millennia trying to prevent. And now a human had activated one of the architect's repositories. From the Warden's perspective, this was a nightmare scenario. Jake had just given humanity access to knowledge that could accelerate their development by thousands of years. Or knowledge that could bring the correction down on everyone's heads. Jake's sensor display showed landing craft detaching from all three ships. The Vrixians were sending a diplomatic team. The Korthians were deploying assault troops. The Wardens were launching something that his sensors couldn't properly identify, some kind of stealth infiltration unit that kept phasing in and out of normal space. They were all coming for the repository. Coming for him. And Jake was just one human with a plasma torch and a really bad feeling about how this was going to end. He looked at his communication panel, still flashing with incoming transmission requests. Then he looked at the shaft leading down to the chamber, where 50,000 years of accumulated knowledge waited in crystalline silence. The repository had chosen to reveal itself to a human. Out of all the species in the galaxy, all the civilizations that could have found it, the architect's safeguards had opened for him. That had to mean something. The repository had been waiting for humanity specifically, for this exact moment. Jake didn't fully understand why yet, but the knowledge burning in his mind suggested there was a reason. Humans were different somehow. Special. And that difference was about to become very important. Jake made his decision. He wasn't going to hide. He wasn't going to run. And he definitely wasn't going to let these aliens decide what happened to humanity's inheritance. The repository had called to him, and he was going to answer that call, consequences be damned. He grabbed his gear and headed back down the shaft. If they wanted the repository, they'd have to go through him first. And Jake Turner hadn't bought a moon base for 50 cents just to give it up without a fight. Jake ran through the corridors of the ancient base, his boots echoing off metal walls as he descended back toward the chamber. His mind raced faster than his feet. The landing craft would touch down in minutes, and he needed answers before armed aliens started kicking down doors. The repository had dumped a galaxy's worth of information into his head, but most of it was still fragmented, like trying to remember a dream after waking up. He needed to go deeper. He needed to understand what made humanity special enough that an extinct civilization had left them a cosmic inheritance. The door to the chamber stood open, still glowing with that otherworldly light. Jake didn't hesitate this time. He strode directly to the central pedestal where the dark orb floated, wrapped in its cage of golden energy. The moment he got close, the connection snapped back into place, and information flooded through him with renewed intensity. Show me, he thought desperately. Show me why humans matter. Show me what I'm supposed to do. The repository responded, and what Jake saw made his blood run cold. Humans weren't from Earth. Not originally. Not really. 50,000 years ago, during the last correction, the architects had watched helplessly as the civilizations they'd studied and catalogued were systematically destroyed. Billions of beings across thousands of worlds, erased by something the architects couldn't fight or reason with. In their final days, the architects made a desperate choice. They couldn't save their own people, but maybe they could save something for the next cycle. They gathered samples. Seeds of potential from hundreds of species that showed promise. And among those samples were early hominids from a world that no longer existed, primitive creatures that barely understood fire but had something the architects recognized. A spark. A refusal to accept limitations. A stubborn determination that bordered on insanity. The architects relocated these proto-humans to Earth, a garden world in a quiet sector far from the galaxy's busy lanes. They modified the human genetic code, adding locks and timers meant to slow development. Humanity was supposed to rebuild slowly, taking 30 or 40,000 years to reach spacefaring status. By then, the galaxy would be empty enough that humans could explore without drawing attention. Without triggering the next correction. But humans had broken every single one of those carefully designed locks. They'd advanced faster than any species in galactic history, driven by curiosity and competition and sheer blood-minded refusal to accept that anything was impossible. The architects had programmed humans to be slow and cautious. Instead, they'd created something unstoppable. Jake felt tears streaming down his face as the full weight of this knowledge settled over him. Every human who'd ever lived was descended from refugees. Every achievement of human civilization, from the pyramids to the moon landing to faster-than-light travel, was built on a foundation of borrowed time. Humanity wasn't supposed to be here yet. They'd crashed the party 10,000 years early. And that's why the other species in the galactic community always seemed dismissive of humans. It wasn't just prejudice or xenophobia. The repository had marked humanity as protected heritage, a designation embedded in quantum fields that other species could subconsciously detect. They didn't know why humans made them uncomfortable, why human achievements seemed less impressive than they should. They just felt it, a nagging sense that humans didn't belong. The Wardens knew, though. They knew everything. They were remnants of species that had survived the last correction by hiding, by making themselves insignificant. They'd spent 50,000 years guiding the new galactic community from the shadows, ensuring nobody advanced too quickly, ensuring the patterns that attracted the correction never repeated. And then humanity showed up and broke every rule in the book. Jake's sensor link to his ship showed the landing craft touching down. The Vrixian team was already at the base entrance, using advanced cutting tools to speed up the process Jake had spent hours on. The Corthian troops were setting up a perimeter, heavy weapons trained on every approach. The Warden craft had landed on the opposite side of the moon, and Jake had lost track of whatever had emerged from it. He had minutes at most before they reached the chamber. Minutes to figure out what he was supposed to do with this knowledge. The repository showed him three options, three paths forward that the architects had anticipated. The first option was destruction. He could trigger a fail-safe built into the repository, collapsing this pocket of altered space and burying the knowledge forever. The architects had included this option for scenarios where the knowledge falling into wrong hands would be worse than losing it entirely. It would kill Jake, vaporize the moon, and leave nothing but debris. But it would keep the repository out of Warden hands. The second option was concealment. He could lock the chamber again, scramble the access codes, make it impossible for anyone to open. The repository would go back to sleep, waiting for some future generation that might be more ready for its secrets. But the Wardens knew it was here now. They'd never stop looking. Eventually, they'd find a way in. The third option made Jake's heart race with possibility and terror in equal measure. The repository could activate fully, not just here but across dozens of hidden sites throughout the galaxy. Every backup the architects had created, every time capsule they'd scattered across the stars, would wake up simultaneously. The knowledge wouldn't be contained or controllable. It would spread like wildfire through the galactic community. But there was a catch. Full activation required a genetic key, something embedded in human DNA that Jake didn't fully understand. The architects had built humanity as more than just refugees or protected heritage. They'd engineered humans to be inheritors, keepers of knowledge meant to guide the next cycle. But using that key would change everything. It would announce to the entire galaxy, and possibly to whatever caused the correction, that humanity had claimed their inheritance. Jake heard sounds echoing through the shaft above. Voices, both human translated and alien. The Vrixian team was descending. They'd be here in seconds. The repository showed him one more thing, and this was the piece that made Jake's decision for him. Hidden in the human genetic code was more than just a key. The architects had embedded potential, capabilities that wouldn't activate until humans were ready. Abilities that would let humanity survive what was coming. But those capabilities would only unlock if someone was brave enough, or crazy enough, to wake them up. Jake thought about his sister back on Mars, lecturing him about responsibility. He thought about all the humans struggling to find their place in a galaxy that didn't quite respect them. He thought about children playing with toy spaceships on colony worlds, dreaming of futures they deserved to see. Then he thought about what humans did best. They didn't follow rules. They didn't accept that some knowledge should stay hidden. They didn't bow to authority just because something was ancient or powerful. Humans asked questions, poked at mysteries, and refused to let the universe tell them what was impossible. The Vrixians were in the chamber now, their translator devices chattering with excitement. The Corthians weren't far behind, weapons ready. Somewhere in the darkness, Jake could sense the Warden presence, old and patient and absolutely certain they could control this situation. Jake placed both hands on the pedestal and felt the repository respond to his touch. The human genetic key activated, and suddenly he understood what the architects had really created. They hadn't just saved humanity. They'd weaponized human stubbornness, human curiosity, human refusal to stay down when the universe knocked them over. They'd created a species that would break the cycle, one way or another. Jake smiled even as the Vrixians shouted at him to stop, even as the Corthians raised their weapons, even as that ancient Warden presence screamed warnings across frequencies his ears couldn't hear. He activated the repository. All of them. Every single one the architects had hidden across the galaxy. The chamber exploded with light, and Jake's 50-cent investment became the most important purchase in human history. For better or worse, humanity was about to inherit the galaxy. And the universe was about to learn why you should never underestimate a species too stubborn to know when they are beat. Retry SF. The moment Jake activated the repository, reality itself seemed to hold its breath. The dark orb at the center of the chamber pulsed once, twice, and then erupted with light that shouldn't exist in normal space. The golden threads containing it didn't break. Instead, they multiplied, spreading outward like a web being woven at impossible speed. The crystalline structures throughout the chamber resonated in harmony, and Jake felt the activation cascade rippling outward through dimensions he couldn't see but somehow knew were there. Across the galaxy, in forgotten corners and hidden places, 53 other repositories woke up after 50,000 years of silence. Some were buried deep beneath the surfaces of dead worlds. Others floated in the emptiness between stars, wrapped in stealth fields that had kept them invisible for millennia. A few were hidden in plain sight, mistaken for natural formations or ancient ruins that nobody had bothered to properly investigate. All of them responded to the human genetic key Jake had unknowingly possessed since birth. The Vrixian scientists in the chamber stumbled backward, their instruments going haywire. One of them was screaming into a communicator, trying to report what was happening but lacking words for what they were witnessing. The Corthian soldiers had their weapons raised, but they weren't firing. Their tactical training hadn't prepared them for a situation where shooting might make things catastrophically worse. And the warden presence, that ancient thing that had been creeping through the shadows, suddenly withdrew. Jake felt it retreating in what could only be described as terror. Whatever the wardens had expected, this wasn't it. They thought they could control the situation, contain the knowledge, put the genie back in the bottle. They were wrong. Jake's connection to the repository deepened, and he understood what was happening with crystal clarity. The activation wasn't just waking up ancient databases. It was broadcasting. Every repository was sending out a signal on frequencies that quantum communication networks used, frequencies that every species in the galactic community monitored. In seconds, billions of beings across thousands of worlds would detect the transmission. They wouldn't understand it at first, but they'd know something enormous had just occurred. More importantly, the repositories were identifying themselves, broadcasting their locations, announcing that the architect's legacy was open for business, available to anyone willing to seek it out. Knowledge that had been hidden for 50,000 years was about to become public domain. Jake pulled his hands away from the pedestal, gasping. His head felt like it was splitting open, but not from pain. From expansion. The repository had given him something, a gift or a burden he couldn't quite define. He could sense the other repositories now, feel them like distant lights in a fog. And he could sense something else too, something human and growing. His ship's communication systems were going absolutely insane. Transmissions were flooding in from Earth, from Mars, from every human colony and outpost in claimed space. Someone had monitored his location. Someone had detected the energy spike. And now humanity was responding the way humans always responded to mysteries, with overwhelming, chaotic curiosity. Jake stumbled to a control panel his ship had linked to and pulled up the incoming traffic. His hands shook as he read the messages. Scientific vessels were already plotting courses toward his coordinates. Corporate exploration teams were mobilizing. The human military was dispatching observation craft. Independent prospectors, colonists, adventure seekers, journalists, conspiracy theorists, and probably a few tourists were all heading his way. It was beautiful chaos, the kind of disorganized swarm response that drove other species crazy. The galactic community operated on hierarchy and protocol. When something important happened, governments convened, councils deliberated, official channels were engaged. It took time. It took procedure. Humans just showed up and started poking things. Jake activated his own transmitter, overriding the Vrixian jamming attempts without even thinking about how he knew to do that. The repository had taught him, downloaded skills and knowledge he was still discovering. He broadcast on every human frequency he could access, his message simple and direct. These are our coordinates. I found something that belongs to humanity. Come see what we inherited. Bring everyone. Bring your questions. Bring your ships. Don't let anyone tell you this knowledge isn't meant for us. He included data packages with everything the repository had shown him about human origins, about the architects, about the cycle of civilizations rising and falling. He held back the scary parts about the correction. People could learn about that later, once they'd had time to process the basics. Right now, he needed to create momentum, a wave of human interest so large that nobody could stop it. The Vrixian team leader approached him cautiously, translator device working overtime. They were demanding he cease the transmission, claiming authority under about 17 different galactic community regulations. Jake ignored them. The Corthian soldiers looked uncertain, weapons still raised but clearly unsure whether they were supposed to shoot a human who was technically on his own property doing legal salvage work. The moon itself was changing. Jake could see it through his ship's external cameras. The crystalline veins of architect technology were spreading across the surface like frost on a window. The entire moon was transforming into a relay station, a beacon broadcasting humanity's claim to their inheritance. Within hours, this forgotten rock would be the most famous location in human space. Within days, it would be the most controversial location in the entire galaxy. The Warden ship broke orbit and jumped to faster than light, retreating to regroup and plan their next move. Jake felt a grim satisfaction watching them go. They'd spent 50,000 years controlling things from the shadows, ensuring nobody upset their carefully maintained balance. Humanity had just flipped the game board, and the Wardens didn't know how to handle it. More human ships were arriving now, the first wave of the curious and the brave. Jake watched them on his sensors, everything from military corvettes to converted cargo haulers to what looked suspiciously like a pleasure yacht. They were establishing orbit, sending greetings, asking 1,000 questions simultaneously. It was glorious chaos. A transmission came through from Earth, official government channels this time. Some admiral demanding a full report and insisting Jake cooperate with proper authorities. Jake smiled and sent back a simple response: "I bought this moon for 50 cents. It's mine. Everyone's invited to visit, but nobody's taking control. This belongs to all of us." The repository pulsed again, and Jake felt it sharing something with him. A final gift from the architects. Hidden throughout human DNA were capabilities they designed, potential waiting to be unlocked. The knowledge of how to access that potential was now spreading through every activated repository. Any human who visited one would receive the same download Jake had gotten, the same understanding of what humanity really was. Humans weren't just another species struggling to find their place in the galaxy. They were inheritors of the architect's legacy, engineered over 50,000 years to be survivors, adapters, the ones who would break the cycle of destruction that had claimed so many civilizations before. The architects hadn't known if it would work. They'd made their best guess, planted their seeds, and hoped. Jake looked at the growing fleet of human ships surrounding the moon and felt something like pride swell in his chest. The architects had bet on human stubbornness, human curiosity, human refusal to accept that anything was truly impossible. Looking at the chaos unfolding around him, Jake figured they'd bet correctly. The correction was still coming. The repository was clear about that. Whatever force pruned back advanced civilizations every 50,000 years was still out there, still following its incomprehensible purpose. But for the first time in galactic history, someone was going to be ready for it. Humanity would have time to prepare, to grow, to unlock the potential the architects had hidden in their genes. And they wouldn't be facing it alone. The other species in the galactic community would have access to the repositories too. Some would resist the knowledge. Some would embrace it. Some would probably try to weaponize it. But that was okay. Humanity had always thrived in chaos, had always done their best work when everyone said something was impossible. Jake sat back and watched his senses as more ships arrived, as the moon transformed, as his 50-cent purchase became the focal point of a galactic transformation. His sister was going to kill him when she found out what he'd done. His friends would probably throw him a parade. History books would argue about whether he was a hero or an idiot for centuries to come. But sitting there in that ancient chamber, surrounded by technology from a dead civilization and watching humanity swarm toward their inheritance like moths to a flame, Jake couldn't bring himself to regret a single thing. He'd bought a moon base for 50 cents and discovered a secret hidden for millennia. In the process, he'd given humanity something they desperately needed: proof that they mattered, that they belonged, that they were meant for something greater than being the new kids everyone dismissed and underestimated. The universe had tried to keep humanity small, had tried to slow them down, had tried to make them insignificant. Jake had just turned that 50-cent investment into humanity's declaration that they were done playing by everyone else's rules. The galaxy would never be the same. And honestly, that was exactly how Jake liked it.